Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook and is almost done with this world history textbook. And again, context is everything. Media Network, context is everything. I'm building my historical context by reading this textbook. So when I finish with the textbook, I'll talk about other things. I'll continue to do a textbook, but that's a different textbook about a different topic. Well, I'll tell you, it's about American history, and it's also very old. It's an American history textbook from the 1940s, which I think is interesting. So that's coming up. But let's do this. Let's finish this book up. We got 5 more episodes. That's it. It's crazy. We're almost done. It's been a year. It's been 10 months. Almost done. Struggles in Southern Africa. Thank you. 68 subscribers. Thank you to all of you. Some of them are me. I'm not going to lie. Thank you to all of you. 69 subscribers. Yes. 70 subscribers. 2 thumbs up. Struggles in Southern Africa. Chapter 36, Section 4. I've read every word. Setting the scene. On May 10th, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood before the wildly cheering crowd. He had just been inaugurated as South Africa's first president elected by voters of all races. The time for healing of wounds has come, he told black and white South Africans. For almost 350 years, whites had dominated South Africa and had denied blacks the most basic civil rights. Mandela's election marked a new beginning for South Africa. In his inauguration speech, he spoke of the need for a new unity, not of revenge for the losses suffered by black South Africans. The crowd sang, Nsuki Nkosi Sikelel Afrika. God bless Africa. The anthem that had come to symbolize South Africa's struggle for freedom. A new heading, Zimbabwe's road to majority rule. During the age of imperialism, European nations had carved up southern Africa. In the 1890s, British businessman Cecil Rhodes took control of the region known as Southern Rhodesia. Later, white settlers turned the region into a self-governing British colony. Whites made up only 5% of the population, but owned half the land and controlled the government. As the tide of nationalism swept through Africa in the 1960s, white Southern Rhodesians flatly rejected any move to give up power to black majority. When Britain supported demands for majority rule, conservative whites led by Ian Smith declared independence in 1965. Armed struggle. In response, nationalist groups waged guerrilla war to achieve majority rule. Among their leaders were Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo. The long struggle caused much suffering. As guerrilla forces won more successes, many whites fled. UN sanctions hurt the economy. Smith finally had to accept a negotiated settlement. In 1980, Southern Rhodesia became the nation of Zimbabwe. It took its name from the ancient kingdom of Great Zimbabwe and stone structures built by the earlier African peoples. Rebuilding. The new nation faced severe changes after years of war. Internal sanctions had further damaged the economy. No, international sanctions had further damaged the economy. The droughts caused additional problems. Recovery was also slowed by a power struggle between Mugabe and Nkomo. In the end, Mugabe won and became elected president of Zimbabwe. He called for a one-party system and promoted national unity and tolerated little opposition. In 2000, tensions over land ownership led to renewed violence. South Africa's long struggle. In 1910, South Africa won self-rule from Britain. Freedom, however, was limited to white settlers. Whites who made up less than 20% of the population controlled vast mineral resources and the most fertile land. Over the next decades, the white minority government passed racial laws to keep black majority in a subordinate position. This is South Africa here. Afrikaner nationalism. After World War II, thousands of blacks moved into towns and cities. There, as elsewhere in Africa, black nationalism stirred demands for equality. In response, Afrikaners who were descended from Dutch settlers demanded severe new limits on blacks. Afrikaners. I think they should tell me what that means. In 1948, the Afrikaner National Party won majority in a whites-only parliament. They then extended the existing system of racial segregation, creating what is known as apartheid, or as a separation of the races. Under apartheid, all South Africans were registered by race: black, white, colored, people of mixed descent, and Asian. Afrikaners claimed that apartheid would allow each race to develop its own culture. In fact, it was designed to give whites control over South Africa. So Afrikaners are white generational residents of South Africa? They didn't say it, but that's what I'm guessing. Apartheid in action. For non-whites, apartheid meant a life of restrictions. Blacks were treated like foreigners in their own land. They had to get permission to travel and had to carry passbooks or face arrest. The pass laws were an especially heavy burden for women who had to get permission from their parents, guardians, or husbands, as well as from the authorities in order to move from one district to another. Blacks were assigned to homelands as based on their ethnic group. Homelands were located in arid, unproductive parts of the country. More than 80% of South Africa, including cities, mines, and rich farmland, were reserved for whites. Apartheid laws banned marriages between races and set up segregated restaurants, beaches, schools, and other facilities. Blacks who worked in factories, mines, and other jobs were paid less than whites for the same work. Low wages and inferior schooling condemned blacks to poverty. Black resistance. From the beginning, black South Africans protested apartheid. In 1912, an organization later called African National Congress, ANC, was set up to oppose the white-dominated domination. In the 1950s, as Afrikaner nationalists imposed harsh new laws, the ANC, African National Congress, organized marches, boycotts, and strikes. As protests continued, government violence increased. In 1960, police gunned down 69 men, women, and children taking part in a peaceful demonstration in Sharpeville, a black township outside of Johannesburg. In the wake of the incident, the government outlawed the ANC and cracked down on groups that opposed apartheid. The massacre at Sharpeville stunned the world. At home, it pushed some ANC activists to shift from nonviolent protest to armed struggle. Some leaders left South Africa to wage the battle for freedom from abroad. Others went underground, including Nelson Mandela. Mandela's struggle. As a young lawyer, Mandela helped organize the ANC Youth League, the African National Congress. With other league leaders, he mobilized young South Africans to take part in acts of civil disobedience against apartheid laws. As government suppression grew, Mandela joined the ANC militants who called for armed struggles against the white minority government. In early 1960s, Mandela was arrested, tried, and condemned to life in prison for conspiracy. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society, he declared at his trial. Mandela did. It was an ideal Mandela hoped to create a free society. No, hoped to live for and to achieve. Oh, free society was something that he wanted to live for and achieve. It was also an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Mandela spent 27 years in prison, often in isolation. Yet he remained a popular leader and powerful symbol of the struggle against apartheid. By the 1980s, demands for an end to apartheid and for Mandela's release intensified. Many countries, including the United States, imposed strict economic sanctions on South Africa. South African athletes were banned from world sports, such as the Olympic Games. In 1984, Black Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu won the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent opposition of apartheid toward reform. Foreign boycotts hurt South Africa's economy. Even worse, in 1985, protests and growing violence at home forced the government to impose a state of emergency. Many South African whites questioned the oppressive measures used by the government. By 1989, a new South African president, F.W. de Klerk, boldly accepted the need for reform. He abandoned apartheid, repealed the hated pass laws, and lifted the ban on the ANC. A year later, he freed Mandela. Over the next 4 years, Mandela and de Klerk negotiated the terms by which South Africa would move to majority rule, from minority rule to majority rule. White voters overwhelmingly approved the reforms that would allow one person, one vote. White voters overwhelmingly approved of it. Okay, so it was overwhelmingly accepted. Let's see. Majority rule. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial elections. Blacks, mixed race, and Asian South Africans, young and old, lined up with white voters to cast their ballots. They elected Nelson Mandela as their first president of a new democratic South Africa. In a speech to supporters, Mandela echoed the African-American civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. We can loudly proclaim from the rooftops, free at last. New South Africa. New heading. As president, Mandela offered a striking example for African nations. When he welcomed longtime political foes into his government. As president, Mandela offered a striking example for other African nations when he welcomed longtime political foes into his government. If he could work with Afrikaners who had once tyrannized the black majority, perhaps other leaders could learn to accept democratic multi-party systems. Let us build together. Masakane was Mandela's slogan and guiding policy. Mandela's government faced a huge challenge of meeting people's high expectations for change. Mandela had promised a better life for the black majority. Delivering on those promises would be difficult. South Africa was a rich country with strong industrial base, but it could afford only a limited amount of spending for housing, education, and other programs. The gap between blacks and whites remained large. Even Mandela's South Africa, whites owned three-fourths of the land. Black unemployment remained high, and the crime rate made both cities and shanty towns around them unsafe. But South Africa's first black president did bring both a peaceful transition and a democratic rule and soaring international prestige to his country. He also introduced new programs from public housing to school lunches, making such necessities as pure water and electrical power available to the masses. In 1999, a second all-race election brought Thabo Mbeki to the presidency. The democratic process seemed to be successful, and people were hopeful for the future. Given the nation's accumulated programs, major changes might take decades rather than years. But a start had been made. Other nations in South Africa. New heading. The colonies in South Africa were among the last to win independence. From the 1960s to the 1980s, South Africa's white minority government intervened to prevent neighboring peoples from achieving freedom. Namibia. In 1920, South Africa received German Southwest Africa as a mandate from the League of Nations. After World War II, the UN asked South Africa to prepare the territory for independence. Instead, South Africa backed the oppressive regime run by the white minority. By the 1960s, Southwest African People's Organization, SWAPO, had turned to armed struggle to win independence. For years, SWAPO, South African People's Organization, SWAPO guerrillas battled the South African troops. The struggle became part of the Cold War, with Soviet Union and Cuba lending their support to SWAPO. The Cold War ground to a halt, and agreement was finally reached to hold free elections. In 1990, Namibia was a new country, and it celebrated its independence. Portuguese colonies. As Britain and France took steps to meet nationalist demands in their African possessions, Portugal clung fiercely to its colonies in Angola and Mozambique. During the 1960s, the Portuguese dictator Antonio Salazar rejected African demands for freedom. In response, nationalists turned to guerrilla warfare. Portugal responded by sending almost its entire army to defend its last outpost of empire. After 15 years of fighting, many Portuguese army officers realized that they could not succeed in the struggle. In 1974, an army coup in Portugal toppled the dictatorship of Salazar's successor. The new Portuguese government quickly agreed to withdraw from southern Africa. In 1975, Angola and Mozambique celebrated independence. Wars continue. Independence did not end the fighting in Angola and Mozambique. Bitter civil wars fueled by Cold War rivalries raged for years in both countries. Both South Africa and the United States had seen the struggle for freedom in southern Africa as a threat because some liberation leaders were socialists. To undermine the new governments, South Africa aided rebel groups in both countries that wanted power for themselves. From 1975 to 1992, rebels in Mozambique starved and killed tens of thousands of civilians. They destroyed schools and health clinics in an effort to overturn the government. The end of the Cold War and South Africa's move to majority rule helped stop the conflict. Throughout Although the task of rebuilding was staggering, by the late 1990s, many had confidence that democratic reforms would succeed. In Angola, a complicated power struggle dragged on for years. The Soviet Union helped one side in the struggle by financing more than 50,000 Cuban troops that went to fight in Angola. South Africa supported a rival group supplying weapons and troops. The United States, too, tried to undermine the Soviet-backed government. Even after Cold War ended, the fighting continued between rival factions in Angola. Outlook and gains. Final heading, and thank you for your time. I appreciate it. 68 subscribers. Thank you all. If you've made it this far, you could be 69 or 70 if you have 2 YouTube accounts. Thank you. I'm joking about that. But, Outlook and gains. Making accurate generalizations about Africa is difficult. Every nation is different. Some nations have rich resources to help finance progress. Others lack resources. Each country has its own set of circumstances and its own history. Despite many setbacks, African nations have made progress. As independent nations, they carved out a place on the world scene and won the power to shape their own future. Within each nation, the process of building a national identity went slowly, but education and urbanization did begin to break the localism of the past. Education and healthcare. As governments set up more schools, literacy rates rose. Every year, more students entered high school. Universities trained a new generation of leaders. A few countries promoted higher education for women, and great strides were made in providing girls an elementary school education. Relatively few girls, however, went to high school because they were needed to help their mothers with farm work and household chores. As a result, illiteracy among African women remained high, especially in rural areas. Most African nations sought to improve health care and create family planning programs. Governments saw that population growth had profound effects on standard of living. Economic opportunity. Despite often depressing economic news, Africa has enormous potential for growth. By the 1990s, many nations had learned from failed policies of the past. With free market reforms, countries such as Ghana enjoyed economic growth. Other nations expanded mining and manufacturing. Some built factories and expanded communication and transportation networks. Cultural influences. In literature, film, and the arts, Africans have made major contributions to global culture. Writing in African languages produced many writers with large local audiences. Other African writers used Western languages to reach a world audience. In music and dance, Africans and members of the African diaspora, African descendants, citizens in other lands, helped shape the culture of the century. Influential diaspora musical forms include jazz, blues, reggae, and samba. That's it. Thank you. God bless. Goodbye. And thank you.